Welcome to day 5 of Unit 4, Empires and Colonies. Today is part 1 of the Sepoy Rebellion and India's first war for independence. First question for today: how did religious beliefs cause divisions in India? We've already talked a little bit about the differences between Islam and Hinduism. Muslim beliefs that oppose eating of pork, for example, compared to Hindu beliefs that oppose the killing of cows and the eating of beef. And the third major religion, Sikhism, which is opposed to the eating of all meat. Most Sikhs are vegetarian. These three major religions you probably already know some things about. Islam, as you can see from these maps, is pretty widespread throughout India, more in few areas than others. Hinduism, more common in the center and less common in the far north and far east. And Sikhism, which is mostly in the Punjab region, as you can see in the blue color as the most dense and the dark gray as the less dense. That is not to say there aren't practitioners of each of these beliefs in all of the places in India, but this gives you an idea of the general distribution. One other side note about the Sikh religion, when you see, say, sepoy soldiers or Indian people generally who wear this type of turban, that is usually a Sikh person. Usually it is not a Muslim or a Hindu person. The Sikh religion has elements of it that regulate the cutting of hair and the covering of hair. And so the turban is, if you see a turban, it's likely not a Muslim person, it's likely a Sikh believer. So the main part of this slide is this picture at the bottom, which represents the practice of Sati. The Hindu practice of Sati was a very ancient tradition in some northern regions of India. There's some debate as to where it originated and when it originated. There's a legend that a widow or a woman who was widowed knew that she was being threatened with rape by an admirer. And so when her husband died, she threw herself on his funeral pyre to prevent herself from being raped and physically attacked by another man. This practice tells us quite a bit about Hindu cultural beliefs, Hindu religious beliefs about men and women in their relationship. And this is a kind of ritual suicide. A Hindu wife in these regions was expected to, on her husband's funeral pyre, after he died, he was going to be cremated. He's on the pyre, lit on fire. She was expected to throw herself into the flames and kill herself in a show of devotion to him, in broken-hearted sorrow, but also in recognition that without him, her life had no meaning, that without him, there was no point to her going on with her life. This was a way to preserve her honor so that she couldn't be forced to remarry, so that she couldn't be raped by another man. And also it's a way for families to kind of relieve themselves from the burden of an unmarried woman. Women in ancient Hindu tradition are supported by their husband, and without a husband, these women would be poor, hungry, homeless, identityless. It's as if they were dead. They would be worse than dead if they continued to live without their husband. So this whole practice was very controversial, and it's not practiced by all Hindus, but those who did practice it felt that it was an important element of their culture and religion. The British East India Company, however, intervened and made this practice illegal, citing that it was discriminatory against women. If a woman died, her husband didn't kill himself through suicide in sorrow. And they also recognized that some families would force their widows into this practice unwillingly. The British made this illegal. However, that offended a large number of people, and it also, in the cases where women were prevented from killing themselves, created a population of impoverished widows with no social network, with no safety net, with no family connections to support them. Then the British East India Company encouraged those widows to remarry, and this was seen as just all a giant misunderstanding and disrespect for the Hindu religion and its beliefs, top to bottom. Divisions thus in India were between Islam and Hinduism over major beliefs like how many gods are there and what kind of food to eat, between Hinduism and Sikhism, between Islam and Sikhism, and also between all of these religions and the British, as exemplified by the practice of Sati. Question number 2. How does the Chapati movement show us the growing unhappiness of people in India? So people in India in the 1800s were growing in their unhappiness. They were continuing to be less and less happy. And how do we know that this was happening? How do we know that things had reached a boiling point, that things had reached a maximum point of stress? There's a weird thing that happened called the Chapati movement in February and March of 1857. Chapati is this kind of flat bread, similar to flatbreads in lots of cultures. It's a pretty easy thing to make, and it's the kind of thing that many Indian people would eat basically every day. The Chapati movement was kind of like a chain letter of bread. So similar to like an internet social media meme where somebody sends it to you and tells you to tag 3 friends and send it to them, or share this picture in 48 hours for good luck, or something like that. The Chapati movement was like a chain letter of that type, but with bread. So somebody would give you a piece of chapati bread and they would tell you, bake 4 more pieces of chapati and then give them to 4 more people urgently. Why do I need to do it? Because you just have to. It's very important. And people didn't really know why they were doing it, but they were so paranoid and so on edge that they believed that it was really, really important to do this. It gave people a feeling of unity. It gave people a feeling of connectedness. And it seemed like kind of like a giant conspiracy that everyone was part of, but no one knew what it meant. People would say, here's a piece of bread. You need to bake 4 more and share them with your friends. Share this with 4 other people, or else what? Or else I don't know. It just needs to happen. People were convinced that it meant something. They didn't know what. British officials that found out about it were convinced that it was some kind of plotting rebellion, that it was some kind of conspiracy against them. People assumed that there were secret messages being hidden inside the breads. None of the intercepted chapati had messages in them. That doesn't mean there weren't any messages, but it just means that the British never found any evidence of it being a secret message network. But Indians themselves were convinced that it was a warning of some kind. Maybe it was a warning that British missionaries were coming to force everybody to become Christian. Maybe it was a warning that the British East India Company officials were coming and going to force everybody to eat food that would defile their caste, that would make everyone equal to the British and thus ruin your ability to be reincarnated, ruin your ability to go to heaven, violate your religion in some important, meaningful way. This happened at the same time that a declining number of British officials, were learning to speak Indian languages. It's a time when the British East India Company was using an increasing number of Indians themselves to rule over the population of the continent. Fewer than 100,000 British people were ruling over 250 million Indian inhabitants. There were rumors floating around that the British were already trying to defile Indians' castes or to ruin their ability to be faithful Muslims by, poisoning the salt supply with pork blood or with cow fat. And then these breads were floating around and people thought it was somehow important. It's like a culinary chain letter. People ran from village to village to hand off the breads with instructions to bake 4 more and pass it on. The watchmen of each village, as you can see on this bottom right-hand side, would run as fast as they could from village to village. In one case, the British were were watching this closely, and they found the message of the breads moving up to 200 miles in one single night. This was faster than the British mail system, so it struck fear in the hearts of the British, and it made the Indian people increasingly paranoid. Last question for today. What was the doctrine of lapse, and how did it give the British East India Company more power? Doctrine of lapse. Doctrine means like law, and lapse means to end. The doctrine of lapse is the law of ending. What does that mean? As you can see in this map, the British directly controlled the regions in yellow, and they indirectly controlled the areas in pink. Indirectly controlled because they were areas controlled by local princes, maharajas, etc., like we talked about in our last lesson. Those areas that were indirectly controlled were controlled by the local royalty, and the British had an alliance with them. However, the British East India Company declared in the Doctrine of Lapse that the royal families of these regions must follow the British law of primogeniture, as in the princes and kings could only pass their crown down to a biological son. This was not the case in Hindu or Muslim culture beforehand, but the British insisted that if there was no male heir to the throne, then leadership of the region would pass to the British themselves. This was extremely unpopular, but the idea was that it would help the British to gradually and peacefully take over more and more portions of India. In a sense, turning this map here on the screen from a blotchy pink and yellow area to a more and more yellow, all British area. One person who opposed this was Queen Laxmibai, or otherwise known as Rani Laxmibai. She was the queen of Jhansi. Jhansi is a small kingdom inside this area in sort of northern Rajasthan. And she did not have a biological child. She had an adopted child. And when her husband, the king, died, the British attempted to claim leadership of her kingdom, and she said no. She's famous for her rallying cry, basically translated as, "I will not give up my Jhansi." She refused to give up her throne. She's depicted here on the right in her queenly clothes. However, she organized the fight against the British when they tried to take over her region. Her adopted child was her intended heir. And after she tried to negotiate with the British to regain control of her kingdom, the British refused, and she ended up fighting them. She gathered her forces. She even got some of her female advisors together, and she led the military attack on the British. She's going to be very important in the rebellion that comes in 1848. I'm sorry, 1857. That's the last question for today. Tune in tomorrow for the second half of the Sepoy Rebellion.